Well, welcome. We're jumping into the New Testament. So we finished up the Old Testament, and now we're tonight looking at the first half of the Gospel of Matthew. And so what were your first impressions on Matthew? Especially, I'd be interested. So we often hear little like pericopes. A pericope is a little section from scripture. And so we hear that in worship, especially from the Gospels, but it's not often that we always just read through the whole book. So I'm curious what your thoughts were and what you learned from just reading through all of it.
Well, I have read this previously, but I grabbed a Bible that gave me a bit more info about why this was written. And I looked for that specifically as I was reading, and it definitely is geared to Jews, not essentially to everyone, but to the Jews, to understand that Jesus is the expected Messiah. And all through it, I really picked up on that through reading many of these chapters. And I guess that had never really impacted me so strongly before. But I found what I was looking for.
And I see that it's there. Can you still hear me? I put on my headphones. Okay, good. And I struggle with that. And I noticed it, like you're saying, Camille, and also I'm using my daughter's study Bible. And so I see all that's there, but it's like I'm bumping my head into the wall every time. Because of what happens later. I mean, later in the life of the church, and that's not something that I know so well, but I do know that and I know that there were, the book of Acts, I think it talks about struggles in the church, about are we really supposed to go beyond, or are we supposed to be, where's our focus supposed to be? Is this message really for everybody? Does that mean everybody? So I would welcome any observations that either of you might have about just trying to accept that, or should we just say putting on the back burner all those questions about who is it for beyond the Jews? Maybe what I'm looking for is more of a solid grounding in what was really happening or what the writer of Matthew, what was the context and going on in that person's mind.
So what you both picked up on, that is one of the key elements of Matthew. So the Gospel of Matthew is, by the way it's written, and we think probably most likely author is a Jewish author in Matthew, and it's being written to emphasize Jesus's Jewish origin and the Jewish identity of Jesus. In this book, with the way as you read it too, it's being written with a Jewish audience in mind. And this is the most kind of Jewish-centered gospel out of all four of them. So not all of them have that same flavor to it. Some are more inclusive of Gentiles or have a little different target audience, but Matthew is definitely a Jewish audience, which is one of the benefits of having four different gospels. Not only do we hear the story in four different ways, but we also have different audiences that the gospel is being written for. And if you think about, just like if you were to write or tell a story, you'd tell the story differently depending what your background is, and or who you're talking to changes what that story, how that story would be told. And Matthew is taking a lot of verses from Mark. So there's a lot of overlap between Mark and Matthew. Mark is the older gospel, most likely, and probably the first written one. So we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similarities within them. And then John is off on John's own. John is just total different structure, different
Mhm.
gospel, doesn't have a lot of shared content, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a
Mhm.
lot of shared content. And in fact, there's all but 60 verses that are from Mark that are also in Matthew.
Mhm.
And so there's so
Mhm.
much overlap between these
Mhm.
two. The other
Mhm.
thing that Matthew does is Matthew corrects those Jewish inaccuracies that Mark has. And so
Mhm.
when Mark is writing, Mark wrote some things that weren't accurate from a Jewish perspective or about Jewish
Really?
traditions, and Matthew corrects them in
Mhm.
Matthew's writing of it.
Mhm.
Which is another reason why we think it's probably being written for a Jewish audience. You're not going to mess up basic stuff when you're a Jewish author and you're writing for a Jewish audience. You
Mhm.
would be discredited if you're doing
Mhm.
that. And
Mhm.
so Matthew is correcting those inaccuracies that are in Mark. There's another source, it seems maybe that exists between Matthew and Luke, because Matthew and Luke share some similar stories that aren't in Mark.
Mhm.
And so in biblical literature, it's often called the Q, so source Q. In German, it's a word meaning starts with Q for
Quelle.
source,
Yeah.
for Quelle, yep. And so the Q source, some scholars say there's not a Q, like we've been looking for the Q forever and there's not a Q. Other
Mhm.
people think, no, for sure there's some Q source that they're both pulling from, and that's why there's
Mhm.
similarities within that.
Mhm.
So there are some unique stories within Matthew and Luke that aren't in Mark. And but one of the reasons, so we're going from the Old Testament and then into the New Testament, and we're starting with Matthew. Why not just start with Mark? Because Mark's the older one. Take Mark, and then we'll go into Matthew and Luke, and then we'll do John because John's on his own and go that way. But Matthew is really bridging us into the Gospels with just the way it's being written. We have
Mhm.
spent the last couple of years going through the Old Testament,
Mhm.
and Matthew is actually the easiest entry for us then into the
Mhm.
Gospels,
Mhm.
because Matthew is quoting regularly, pulling us back. Where is this coming from? From the Hebrew Bible. Where is it? Where are these connection points? Where are these prophecies coming from? Where are these even terms or words being said? What is the law? And how did Jesus'
Mhm.
interpretation of the law impact that understanding
Mhm.
of the law? And
Mhm.
so everything we've talked about from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament is being revisited in the Gospel of Matthew.
Mhm. Yeah, he quotes from the prophets frequently, and refers to some of the Jewish laws frequently
Oh yeah.
to discredit them, which I
Also to
thought was
make them stronger, though, too, in
Mhm.
some cases.
Mhm. Yes, but I guess if Jews were reading this or hearing it for the first time, they could not mistake that this message is for them. Listen, we're waiting and waiting and waiting for the Messiah. Well, guess what? This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this who said this would happen, and so on and so forth. They make a very strong case. I would imagine something that was very, very difficult to refute. They tried. They certainly gave for effort, but they did not succeed, I don't believe.
Well, and this was written sometime, it would have been written between late first and early second century,
Mhm.
after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE,
Mhm. Mhm.
because of the references to the temple destruction in here. I think it was after that. So we
Mhm.
also have to remember to think of how far back we were talking about those prophecies in the Hebrew Bible. And that's like ancient history to the people who would have been hearing this story about Jesus or even would have been walking with Jesus. Is those prophecies are like, yeah, we've heard these things, but like we're still waiting.
Mhm.
And it's just been nonstop waiting. And
Mhm.
so kind of a are you like, really? Well, convince me. And so that's what the
Mhm.
Gospels in Matthew is trying to do to that audience as well.
Mm-hmm.
And not everybody is convinced. I mean, that we still, the Jewish traditions and faith, there's still a very strong faith, and there's a lot of richness in there and continued development. And so not everybody is convinced of that in the Jewish communities. And it's also one of the reasons, you probably noticed when you read Matthew that we start with the genealogy.
Oh, yes.
So I know genealogy is never the absolute favorite, but that's where we start in here. And so that would be important to a Jewish audience, to be starting with genealogy and to be walking through it that way. Because it's rooting Jesus not only in the prophecies and in the scripture, but within that line of all those who had come before. And so we have this Israel's family tree. Where does Jesus fit within Israel's family tree? And showing where does Jesus fit within the Jewish traditions, just through this lineage and family tree part of this.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting to know that there were some very questionable characters involved in this genealogy. Tamar and Rahab. Ruth was not an Israelite; she was a Moabite. And I think I think that really fleshes out the genealogy of Jesus. I really do.
Right.
You know, you got to have a few rotten apples in the bunch.
The line of David certainly wasn't perfect. David himself certainly wasn't perfect.
Wasn't perfect. True. Oh boy, he started out pretty good. But yeah, I got a chuckle out of that. I just got a chuckle out of that. And if the virgin birth is to be believed, then Joseph really wasn't in the line.
Right.
But I think Mary was, so. But she didn't get mentioned. It was Joseph.
And it is in Matthew. Matthew's the only place where Joseph is more fleshed out than in the other Gospels. In the other Gospels, there's more focus on Mary and less on Joseph. And we have different genealogy lineage between some of the Gospels too. Some of them are following more through Mary's father, Joseph, and the others are following Joseph, to be husband of Jesus, or husband of Mary. The other thing that, so some bad apples and discrepancies as far as in genealogy were not always super smooth, is the culture that's happening at the time too, that Jesus is being born into. So there's a reason why when we talk about Advent and preparation, we do a lot of discussion about like this light coming into darkness, or love coming into chaos. And some of that is echoes back to Genesis and the creation of the world, that this is a new world being created with new ways of being with one another. It's also echoes to what is happening within the culture at the time. And so I have a short video that kind of walks us through from, so the last thing we studied was the exile, and them returning from exile, and then up till Jesus's birth. And there's a lot of history that's happening in there, because we've got the rise of the Greek cultures and Rome, and we've got some revolts, and so there's quite a bit going on. So I'm going to share that so we can watch that. This is the culture at the time of Jesus, but they do a good job kind of walking through some background.
Of drive-through history, we looked at the Jewish people, their heritage, and the Messiah that they eagerly expected. But it's important to remember that during the Gospels period, not all Jews were living devoutly religious lives. For many during this period, teachings of a Messiah were ancient lore, the stuff of bedtime stories, stories that no longer seemed that relevant in the culture in which they now lived.
330 years prior to the birth of Jesus, a Greek named Alexander began an extensive military campaign, conquering the entire Persian Empire, which then included Judea. In 332 BC, Alexander captured Jerusalem and brought with him the Greek culture known as Hellenism. Now, the word Hellenism comes from the Greek word Hellenismos. This word came to describe a set of values for living that was invented by the ancient Greeks. Hellenism would come to dominate the Mediterranean region for centuries. By 313 BC, Hellenistic ideas had begun expanding into the Near East and Central Asian cultures. It was the empire's governmental framework to rule by establishing hundreds of cities for trade purposes. The influence of Hellenism included everything from art, architecture, and morality to clothing, hairstyles, and food. Many of the existing cities began or were compelled by force to adopt Hellenized philosophy, religious sentiments, and politics. The Hellenistic religion included everything from worshiping Greek gods and goddesses to consulting oracles to the study of astrology. After the death of Alexander, Judah fell to the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire was a major center of Hellenism and sought to impose it on Judah. The Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes, banned key Jewish religious rites and traditions and defiled the temple. Not surprisingly, this caused an uprising.
In 166 BC, a group of Jews called the Maccabees began a fierce revolt, which brought a time of independent Jewish rule called the Hasmonean dynasty. For a time, they flourished, but ultimately their attempts to maintain their freedom and to cleanse their culture of the outside influence of Hellenism failed. That's because in 63 BC, another outside force, this time the powerful Roman Empire, imposed its rule in the region. Because the Roman Empire had largely adopted Hellenism, Greek culture again re-entrenched itself in Judea.
All of this happened during the 400-year period between the writing of Malachi, the last prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures, and the birth of Jesus.
At this point in the gospel story, Judea had become a crossroads of cultures and ideas. By this time, many Jews had grown quite comfortable and had adapted to Greek influence and the relative peace that went along with Roman control. It's what people do. They adapt. But devout Jews hated Roman rule with its mixed bag of polytheistic and pagan beliefs which stood in direct opposition to their beloved Jewish law. For them, Roman rule was yet another sad chapter in a long history of oppression that they had had to endure as a people. It was into this cultural milieu that Jesus of Nazareth arrived.
The Gospel according to Matthew.
So there's just some background on what was happening in those hundreds of years in between. And then also remembering too, so when we last left off, we were with the Persians, but the Persians had overthrown the Babylonians, and the Persians were more tolerant than the Babylonians. But then after the Persians came the Greeks, and Greek culture has had a pretty large impact on our own culture and brought a number of things as far as democracy and pieces like that. But Greeks also changed a lot of things as far as the Persians outlawed slavery. The Greeks were built on slavery. And so there were other human rights things that the Greeks overthrew that the Persians were really good, had some good human right laws that they would follow. And the Greeks overthrew a number of those. And so we get a lot within the Gospels too. And you probably saw some of it even just starting in Matthew, where we are hearing discussions about slavery and discussions about even this being a slave for things. And that's part of the Hellenism culture that's been brought in and shows itself through the gospel readings, because people understood that because Hellenism had so much become part of the culture. And it's also what Jesus speaks out against is some of that Hellenism too. And remembering back, this is consistent throughout the Hebrew Bible too, is that there's other cultures and other religious beliefs that the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, speaks very strongly against adopting some of those practices and turning away from the laws of God and the ways of being with one another and picking up on these other cultures, especially those that do not allow one another to love their neighbor fully and to love God fully. Any thoughts on history or anything that you have about the history leading up to this that you'd like to add?
I can see easily how not just the Jewish culture, but the people who were alive at that time could be easily persuaded to take a look at some of the new folks coming in and saying, gee, that doesn't look bad, and gee, that doesn't feel bad, and that would probably be just a slight improvement. Became a little in the middle, you know. Yes, our old laws are good, but you know, it's not bad to incorporate some of these other things. And I couldn't help but think of Israel today. They don't have just one central religion. I mean, they're all Jews, but the way they feel about their Jewishness, about the religion of being a Jew, the Jewish religion, they've got as many sects as we Christians have on this side. And it's interesting because you go all the way from the Hasidics all the way to the modern young people who are much more susceptible to change. What, Mary?
Well, and I was just thinking about, and even to being secular. I mean, they're Jewish, but you know, there are those in that tradition. And I would just add that this is, at least to my eyes, I can't really speak for others, but it's still a very violent age. Not that we haven't lived through our own violent age. We are in a violent age. Maybe humans really never have gotten out of a violent age. It's just more, you know, it's all more or less in the movement. The pendulum of history goes back and forth and so on. But the Romans had their setup, and if you played the game in certain ways, then things would be tolerated, and then otherwise. But certain things, forget it. You know, you have to have your allegiance to Rome, or you are put out of the picture. You know, and we still, I mean, that idea is still alive on Earth, regrettably, but it is in certain places. But we live, and certainly I've lived all my life in the peace and security of where we live in our country. And it's quite appalling to try to come to grips with just, I mean, I guess I'll just call it the violence of that era. And disregard for human life. Whoa.
Yeah. And I think you have hit on something too, Mary, that in some ways we've never gotten out of that as well. Even looking at, I was talking with somebody about alien movies. So whenever we have new alien movies, we imagine that whatever life, if they're aliens, whatever life comes to Earth, they're all going to attack and destroy us and start a massive war. Like that's the only way we usually imagine other life, because that's in part the only way we see ourselves, that war is inevitable. And then Jesus comes and offers this whole different alternative that says, you know what? War isn't inevitable. Violence is not inevitable. And the only way to break it is to stop participating in it, which is what Jesus does. And there is a lot of violence that's done to him, but not at any point does he turn and do the violence back, even unto his death. That look, we need to stop. Like, you have to break the cycle. And we see that too. And just even at a more local level, when we see cycles of abuse, you have to stop the cycle of abuse in order to have the abuse stop. You have to walk away from it, or you have to not continue it through the generations to the next generation that you're raising, and have to break it in some way. And we see cycles of abuse between nations, and for some reason we seem to be stuck, and we have to build up our military, or we have to build up weapons of destruction. We have to be on the cutting edge in order to be prepared for violence to retaliate back. And that's certainly not the way that Jesus talks at all about it. But yeah, it's definitely, there's a violent time they're coming out of, and there is more stability though than there was earlier during the prophets. So they are experiencing a little more stability at this point in time, when, as far as politically, there's disagreements and there's repercussions for disagreeing, but it's a little more stability than the exile, for sure. And so there's also instability. There's also there's more time to disagree about theology when we have stability. Here's one of the benefits of having some stability as far as being out of survival mode, means we can intellectually disagree more easily, because we're not just in survival mode. And that's another piece that Jesus is walking into. And we hear that too, as Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, and then he's talking about the Sadducees, and he's telling them both they're wrong, and using the things that they believe. You've got one side believes in resurrection, the other side does not. One believes there's oral tradition that's important, the other one says it's just the literal word of God and that's it. And so they're going head to head here with the Sadducees and Pharisees, and both parties are on the council. They're both part of the leadership of this time, and not agreeing. And Jesus, we could take that into our own system, kind of the amount of extremism we have within our own political system right now, with disagreements. And Jesus in some ways was walking in that too. They were religious disagreements, but at this time, religion and politics is very integrated. You could say they're still very integrated. We just use different words for that in our own culture. And so there's pieces that Jesus speaks about that could speak to us now too. What did you notice about the structure of Matthew? Anything pop up?
Are you talking about the frequent use of parables and
Okay.
Yeah,
I have trouble seeing it.
Okay.
Go ahead, Camille.
Well,
we can come to how I'm not lost later on.
There are so many areas here where I've got, after any specific verse, I usually have something in parentheses or regarding that particular verse that goes back to the Hebrew scriptures. So they are going back a great deal to make their point, you know. I must confess, I did not go back and read all that stuff in Hebrew scriptures because I was a little pressed for time.
Yeah, those are important elements
Yeah.
of Matthew for sure.
Mhm.
That the use of parables and at different sections, and then also the going back at the end of each section to the Hebrew scriptures to pull that in.
And it happens very frequently, at least through the first half of Matthew.
Yep.
I didn't read the whole
Continue.
book yet.
I found it difficult because this is what was going through my mind as I'm seeing an overarching structure. And Gretchen, I think you alluded to somewhat that there being one early in our session this evening, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from both of you about that, because I'm going and to me it's story, all of which I've heard many times from youngest childhood. And so I'm it's like beads on a string to me. And I would say next to nothing for a perspective of a larger. I don't think the author of Matthew was just, oh, I'm going to tell this story and I'm going to tell this story in that way. So help me out.
Yeah. Well, I think visuals are the easiest for this. So we've got a video from the Bible Project. Much easier than words. And the first thing they talk about is structure.
Yeah, and let's not lose that theme, Mary, because I had something I wanted to share as well.
You want to share it now?
Yeah.
Well, like you, I went over that, and I've been a lay minister for a lot of years now, for a couple decades now, and I can remember preaching on some of these things, and I'm thinking, but I have never ever really considered the whole. And the whole, even though they are like beads on a string, those beads eventually all become connected, be one necklace or one bracelet or whatever, because they all are saying, okay, this is what the Hebrew scripture says. However, there's a new way to look at this. That's why Jesus did not explain the parables to very many people other than his disciples. He wanted to plant the kernel. He wanted to plant the seed and let them chew on it, because many of the parables were not understood by the people who heard them, yet they would flock to hear them. Does that make any sense, Mary? See, I don't see them as disjointed stories, is what I'm saying.
Okay, well, that's an idea for me to try on for side. So that it's a step in the direction.
Okay.
So let's take a look at,
Okay.
because Bible Project's going to show us some of the structure that's within.
The Gospel according to Matthew. It's one of the earliest official accounts about Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. The book itself is anonymous, but the earliest reliable tradition links it to Matthew the tax collector, who was one of the 12 apostles that Jesus appointed, and he actually appears within the book itself. For about 30 to 40 years, the apostles orally taught and passed on their eyewitness accounts about Jesus, along with his teachings that they had all memorized. And Matthew has then collected and arranged all these into this amazing tapestry and designed the book to highlight certain themes about Jesus. In this video, we're just going to cover the first half of the book. Specifically, Matthew wants to show how Jesus is the continuation and fulfillment of the whole biblical story about God and Israel. That Jesus is the Messiah from the line of David, that he is a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and not only that, Jesus is God with us, or in Hebrew, Emmanuel. And Matthew's designed this book with an introduction and then a conclusion, and these act like a frame around 5 clear sections right here in the center, each of which concludes with a long block of Jesus' teaching. Now, this design is very intentional and it's amazing. Just watch how this works. Chapters 1 through 3, they set the stage by attaching Jesus' story right onto the storyline of the Old Testament scriptures. So Matthew opens with a genealogy about Jesus that highlights how he is from the messianic line of the son of David, and he's a son of Abraham. That means he's going to bring God's blessing to all of the nations. After that, we get the famous story about Jesus' birth and how all of the events fulfilled the Old Testament prophetic promises, that the nations would come and honor the Messiah, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but even more than that, Jesus' conception by the Holy Spirit, his name Emmanuel, all these work together to show that Jesus is no mere human. He is God with us, God become human. So you can see 2 of Matthew's key themes right here in the introduction. He's from the line of David, he's Emmanuel. But Matthew also wants to show how Jesus is a new Moses. So like Moses, Jesus came up out of Egypt, he passed through the waters of baptism, and he entered into the wilderness for 40 days. And then Jesus goes up onto a mountain to deliver his new teaching. So through all of this, Matthew is claiming that Jesus is the promised greater than Moses figure who's going to deliver Israel from slavery. He's going to give them new divine teaching. He's going to save them from their sins and bring about a new covenant relationship between God and his people. This Moses and Jesus parallel also explains why Matthew has structured the center of the book the way that he did. These 5 main parts highlight Jesus as a teacher, and he's created a parallel. Jesus as a teacher parallels the 5 books of Moses. Jesus is the new authoritative covenant teacher who's going to fulfill the storyline of the Torah. Now, in the first section, chapters 4 to 7, Jesus steps onto the scene announcing the arrival of God's kingdom, and this is really key. The kingdom is, in essence, about God's rescue operation for his whole world, and it's taking place through King Jesus. Jesus has come to confront evil, especially spiritual evil, and its whole legacy of demon oppression and disease and death. Jesus has come to restore God's rule and reign over the whole world by creating a new family of people who will follow him, obey his teachings, and live under his rule. So, after Jesus begins healing people and forming a movement, a community, he takes his followers out to a mountain or a hillside, and he delivers his first big block of teaching, traditionally called the Sermon on the Mount. And here Jesus explores what it looks like to follow him and live in God's kingdom. And it's an upside-down kingdom where there are no privileged members. So the poor, the nobodies, the wealthy, the religious, everybody is invited and is called to turn, to repent, and to follow Jesus and join his family. Jesus says that he's not here to set aside the commands of the Torah or the Old Testament. Rather, he's here to fulfill all of that through his life, through his teachings. He's here to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly love God and love their neighbor, including their enemy. After concluding his great teaching on the kingdom, the next section shows Jesus bringing the kingdom into reality in the day-to-day lives of people. So Matthew's arranged here 9 stories about Jesus bringing the power of God's kingdom into the lives of hurting, broken people. There are 3 groups of 3 stories, and they're all about people who are sick or have broken bodies or they're in danger, and Jesus heals or saves them by these acts of grace and power. And then right in between these triads, we find 2 parallel stories about Jesus' call that people should follow him. Matthew's making a point here. One can only experience the power of Jesus' grace by following him and becoming his disciple. Now, after Matthew has shown the power of the kingdom through Jesus, Jesus then extends his reach by sending out the 12 disciples who are going to go do what he's been doing. And this leads to the second large block of teaching, chapter 10. And here, Jesus teaches his disciples how to announce the kingdom and what to expect once they do. Many among Israel are accepting Jesus and his offer of the kingdom, but Israel's leaders, they aren't. They stand to lose a lot if they repent and become disciples of Jesus. And so Jesus knows they're going to reject him and persecute his followers, which is exactly what happens. In the next section, chapters 11 through 13, Matthew has collected a group of stories about how people are responding to Jesus and his message, and it's a mixed bag. So some stories are positive. People love Jesus and they think he's the Messiah. Others are more neutral, like John the Baptist, or even the members of Jesus' own family. And they make it clear that Jesus is not what they expected. And then you have Israel's leaders. They're entirely negative. You have the Pharisees and the Bible scholars. They all reject Jesus together. They think he's a false teacher. He's leading the people astray. They think he's blasphemous in these exalted claims he's making about himself. But Jesus isn't surprised or thrown by all these diverse responses. In fact, he focuses on it in the third block of teaching, chapter 13. Here, Matthew's collected together a bunch of Jesus' parables about the kingdom, like about a farmer throwing seed on 4 types of soil, or about a mustard seed, or a pearl or buried treasure. These parables are like a commentary on the stories that you've just read in chapters 11 and 12. Some people are accepting Jesus with enthusiasm. Others are rejecting him. But God's kingdom is of ultimate value, and it will not stop spreading despite all of these obstacles. So that's the first half of the Gospel according to Matthew. Now here's a few more things to look for as you read through these chapters. Matthew's presenting Jesus, remember, as the continuation and fulfillment of the Old Testament storyline. So look for how he weaves in quotations from the Old Testament scriptures. And what you'll find is that they're placed at strategic points in the story, explaining more about Jesus and his identity. So stop, take time to go look up these references and read them in their Old Testament context. And most often you'll discover really cool, interesting connections. Lastly, pay attention to the types of people who accept Jesus and follow him. And you'll see that it's most often people who are unimportant, they're nobodies, or they're irreligious. And these are the people who are transformed by their trust or faith in Jesus and follow him. And it's the religious and the prideful who are offended by him. So how is this tension between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? That's what the second half of Matthew is all about.
Yeah, I will do that. I'll take time to look up all that stuff.
Yeah, I thought when you said that, Camille, I was like, Bible Project is going to talk directly to you there.
Well, you know
Oh, great, that's great.
what surprised me though is there we go. If you look at the new Moses, underneath, Jesus is greater than Moses. And what is the first thing there? Delivery from slavery. And I think that's where a lot of people got stuck, because Jesus was then expected to be a king to overthrow Rome. And that isn't at all what he was talking about. They just missed the boat. They missed the message. They missed the impact. Of course, here we are over 2,000 years later, and we've had time to think about it.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Just the disciples, they were willing to drop everything and follow him. And I mean, that's incredible. I mean, how many of us can say we would do that if somebody came up to us and said, "Hey, I've got this word from God. Will you drop everything you're doing and follow me?"
Sure. Would you like to follow me to the 7th floor at Stanford?
Yeah, that's something that we
Little
assume.
white jackets.
Yeah, and that's something. So I mean, mental illness is a real thing, and people do have things that they might see, things that maybe are not really there because of a mental illness. But also, sometimes we might be disregarding some people's outlooks on life or experiences that they've had just because it is out of the ordinary. And that's a danger that we also fall into, and a danger that they probably fell into at that time. We've got the religious leaders who are seeing this happening, and they're like, no, this guy's not, like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Stop
Mhm.
following him. Like, we
Mhm.
need to go back to reading the book and following just what's in the book. And they're like, no, did you see what he did? He did all these things. We got to keep following. And so it's pretty incredible. We do have an extra 2,000 years to think about this, and the benefit too of it being normalized with where we are now, which also makes it a lot easier for us to follow than it would have been at that time.
Mhm. That's true.
Any other thoughts on this? I'm keeping it up. Just, I think it's easier to see the structure. And Mary, I know.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Did that
Yeah.
make it clearer, Mary? Did that
Well,
help?
yes, but here's these Bible projects overviews, and I'm glad for them, and Gretchen, don't stop doing them. They are so dense, and I feel like I'm kind of being almost like inoculated with this, and I cannot grasp it all. So if the two of you will keep dragging these by my conscience, well, it just, in some ways, maybe it would be easier if you weren't dealing with a lifetime of hearing these things, but the presentation has been different, or the emphasis has been different. And so I am very glad for what Gretchen, what you said a little while ago about Advent and the emphasis on light into darkness. And I personally find that, and the concept of the organized church year, very helpful to me because it helps me put together, if you will, with some new insight. It's the combination of what I have heard before, what has been part of my life before, with some new insight, and also just the remembering of it. And especially, like the first Sunday of Advent it's one of my one of my favorite, most meaningful days for me, because it comports with my worldview. And it's like every year, like you'd think maybe some years would be more light filled, and you wouldn't come around to the first Sunday in Advent and it's again so dark, and we just have this little kind of, and yet it is. We're still in COVID, and we are still in many of these same difficulties in our world and our lives in the present day, as we were last year and all the years before, and why we need the message of Advent. And I'm going to get out I keep an Advent wreath, and we don't do it absolutely every day, but I find it to be a meaningful spiritual practice to look at that little light, and it can grow and does grow, and that brings us through Christmas, and then we have our little period after Christmas, and then we move through Lent to Easter, and it's these. I'm guessing that the way that those traditions have endured is because many others have felt as I do in these 2,000 years that we've had to think about it, if you will.
Yeah, and there is a lot of information as we watch the Bible Project, but the thing is, nothing about the Bible is meant to be just all academic and fully understood. That it's actually the experience of reading it, and there should always be some mystery in it, and things where it's, I don't understand, because that is intentionally in the scriptures as well. That reading should also be a humbling experience, as far as, there is so much I do not understand And that's it's designed that way too. So Mary, you are picking up on exactly how it's designed. So
okay, thank you.
yeah. And that's part of even in Jewish traditions, that reading scriptures is meant to be a meditative read as well. So we're going through it a little more with it, looking at the literature, the literary structure, the historical background, and to make it just richer as we're doing that reading. But as far as with our spiritual lives and the deepening of that, it's good to have that in mind. And we also need to be reading it with an air of mystery and that humility that we don't understand all of it. And there's more to it than we even know. And with the church year, the church year is intentionally designed to tell these stories. That's intentionally designed to force our bodies to walk through those stories too, and to have our lives do that. So Advent, a time of preparation, a time of waiting. We like pack into 4 weeks everything that went from Genesis to the birth of Christ.
Whoa.
No wonder.
Talk about dense.
Every year. But that's what we're doing. All the prophecies, all the promises of God, everything. 4 weeks of waiting. And we're saying, in part, I think, we're not good at waiting. And so 4 weeks of waiting seems like a really long time to us. But this is thousands of years of waiting that we're packing into this 4 weeks of waiting. And
yeah, I think your tradition of assembling the nativity scene, just a few characters at a time every week, is great. I've never ever thought of doing that before, but that does build the anticipation up for, okay, now we can celebrate the whole 9 yards.
right.
That's
It's also
great.
really good for little kids because then
Yes, yes.
something
Well, there's a little kid in every single one of us.
This is
Yeah,
true.
yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
that is great.
But then we also get in the other rest of the seasons of the year, Christmas and Epiphany, and getting into Lent and Easter. Those are part of the story too. We're really walking through the whole Bible every single year. And we have a 3-year cycle that we walk through the Bible. And in that 3-year cycle, we do not read all the scriptures in the Bible.
No.
There's too much for us to cover even in 3 years. And so we've picked, so there's things that in doing the Bible study that we've read that you won't hear in church if we just follow the lectionary. Because how the lectionary is designed. They try to cover as much ground as possible, but really it takes individuals and collective study too, outside of just Sunday morning. So, so you're right on, Mary, if you feel like you don't get it all.
I hope that's it. Maybe there's some good theology in it then.
You bet. I think our spiritual path is a path of continual growth. I don't think there is a point at which you see a sign that says a dead end. There are always, that road is always going, and sometimes there's forks and sometimes there's not, and but it is a continual path of growth, and I think that's a beautiful thing.
Are there any pieces in here that you, in this first half, that you wanted to talk about? So in the Gospels, I'm wanting to do more of a broad overview because I know on Sundays we often dive deep into just a few verses. And so we are practiced in diving deep and not as practiced in the New Testament in seeing the broad structure. And so that's why for our classes, we're going to focus a little more on the broad structure because that's what we don't know as well.
Okay.
One of my favorite things is from Matthew 5, we have the Beatitudes. And they're really interesting when you read them in Aramaic. As blessed are the poor, blessed are those, blessed. In Aramaic, it's Ashrei, and Ashrei, blessed, means to turn around, to repent, to become righteous. And so it's very active and not passive at all. So it's not sit back and be blessed, you who are poor in spirit. It's more of a rally cry that is like, get up if you're poor in spirit and claim that for yourself. Like it's a very active thing that you might hear on the Capitol grounds, not something you would hear in a meditation. That was interesting when I heard that from a native Aramaic speaker explaining how they read it from their perspective.
There's there are a whole bunch of ideas in what you just said there, Gretchen.
Yeah.
If you want to have some real fun, read those in several different versions. And you'll see that there are nuances of differences if you go into different versions, which is always kind of fun sometimes.
Anything else from the first half? Otherwise, we'll pick up with the death of John the Baptist next week, I guess.
We read the death of God the Baptist.
We did read it, but it's
in
just
this
the
first
second
half.
half. So
Oh yeah, okay.
well, that's where we'll start at 14 for next
Oh,
week.
okay.
You've already read 14 though, so you can read 15 through 28. We just
Okay.
cut it in half for the ease of reading.
Okay.
And we'll find out how the story ends and how Matthew completes that structure that we saw.
Okay.